If you own a house, you really ought to have a workbench somewhere, whether it's in the basement, a back room, a garage, some sort of table that's built to take a little bit of abuse, so that way you can do things such as replace the cord on a lamp, maybe sharpen lawnmower blades, stuff like that. Little repairs that you don't want to do on the kitchen table. Well, in this episode we're going to build this workbench right here. This is a perfect workbench for a homeowner. It's not very big, it's 5 feet long, it's 28 inches deep. It has a backsplash with a little shelf for extra storage. There's a shelf for storage underneath the workbench, and the nice thing is it doesn't take a whole lot of tools, and it doesn't take any experience using those tools in order to make a functional workbench. Before we talk about the tools required for this project, we need to talk about the plans, because in order to build a workbench you need a set of plans, whether it's a set of plans you make up yourself on the back of a napkin or a factory-made set of plans that you download somewhere. It's very hard to do this just looking at a pile of lumber. In this case, I used a modified set of plans from Family Handyman magazine. This is their classic DIY workbench. I think I said that right. Regardless, I'm going to put a link to their plans on their website in the description box below if you want to go and take a look at those, download them, and use those plans. That's what I used for this. I modified it to use the plywood instead of, they use dimensional lumber because around here the dimensional lumber is not very good and it wouldn't stay very flat. This thing would look like a Pringle in about a day if I made the top out of 2x8s like they did. Also, for the money, it was cheaper to use 2 layers of 3/4 inch plywood for the top and the shelf versus dimensional lumber. So I did that. I also changed their dimensions slightly to fit my space and my height. So that's the other thing. Don't be afraid to get a set of plans, keep what you like from the plans, but then modify it to fit your needs. Once you have your set of plans, you're going to need some tools. Most of these tools you should already have, but if you don't, this is a good time to get them and try them out and get used to them. First tool that every homeowner should have already is a cordless drill. This happens to be an 18-volt cordless drill. You can get them in 12-volt. I would recommend 18-volt for this project because we're using some 2.5 inch long screws in a lot of this, and the 18-volt drills have a bit more power than the 12 volts, so it handles those long screws a bit easier. 12 will do it, but 18 will do it even better. A drill by itself really isn't that useful. We need some drill bits. All the drill bits I used on this project are from this case. The Torx bit, the Phillips head bit, the extension, the 1/8 inch drill bit were all out of this case. If you don't have a variety pack of drill bits, I highly recommend that you purchase a variety pack of drill bits and then use them. If they wear out, replace those individual bits with individual bits off the shelf from a hardware store, but you have it all neatly stored in one case. We're going to need some screws for this project, and we only use 2 lengths of screws. 2.5 inch long construction screws that has a very aggressive thread, and a star head. You can also get these with a square drive head, and 1.25 inch drywall screws. And these just happen to have a Phillips head to them. Those are the 2 screws we're going to need. So when you buy the screws, make sure you have the driver bits to use them. Some packages of screws come with a driver bit already, others don't, so just make sure you have the ones you need. Throughout the project, I used these quick grip clamps quite a bit. And the way they work, they have a little lever here that disengages the movable jaw, and then you have the long lever to squeeze. These were a 2-pack at my local Ace Hardware. It was just under $20 for these two, and I use them all the time. If you get these for this project, I guarantee you you're going to find lots of uses for these around the house. You're also going to need standard things like a tape measure and a pencil. This happens to be a carpenter's pencil. It's flat so it doesn't roll. The lead is very big so that way it doesn't break very easily, but a regular pencil will work just fine. Going to need a speed square. Speed squares come in plastic or aluminum. They're basically a triangle that's a perfect 90 degrees from this edge to this lip. That way you can put the speed square up against an edge and it gives you a 90-degree guide. You also get a 45-degree angle with it. We're going to use this quite a bit, and it comes in handy around the house for all sorts of things. The final tool we're going to need is one that if you plan on doing any kind of DIY stuff, you're going to want sooner rather than later, and this is a great project to try it out on, and that is a circular saw. If you're just getting into DIY stuff, I highly recommend you get an inexpensive 7¼ inch corded circular saw. You're going to pay extra for the cordless version, and depending on what your price point is for that cordless saw, it might not have much power and you might be very disappointed with the thing. Even the cheap corded ones usually have more power than the cheap cordless ones. This was just under $25 from Harbor Freight. I spent another $10 on the blade, and speaking of the blade, this saw takes a 7¼ inch blade. 7¼ sounds like a strange number, but it's the standard circular saw blade diameter. So if you have a choice, I highly recommend you get a saw with a 7¼ inch blade, because you can find those blades at any hardware store or lumber yard or home center. Probably even some grocery stores have 7¼ inch circular saw blades. That way you can always find a new blade if you hit a nail or something with it and it breaks a tooth or it just gets dull. And they're inexpensive. You can get good blades cheaply because they make so many of them. If you end up with a 5-inch or 6-inch circular saw, those blades aren't quite as common, so your choices are going to be somewhat limited, and the price usually ends up being more expensive just because they don't sell as many. The final thing we're going to need is a pair of sawhorses, because we need to be up off the ground when we do all the cuts and we assemble this thing. Really, any kind of sawhorses will do it. I would recommend finding the cheapest set of sawhorses you can find and use them. Let me explain the setup. We have two 2x4s on the sawhorses that are going to support the plywood as we cut it, because if we just put the plywood on the sawhorses with nothing supporting it, as soon as we start cutting, it's going to collapse on itself. These 2x4s are going to get reused as parts of the workbench, so we're just going to make very slight cuts in them, and then we'll turn the cut side of the 2x4s to face the wall so you'll never see it. The plywood we're using is called AC plywood. What that means is there's a good side, the A side, and an ugly side, the C side. I've got it so that the worst side is facing up. The way the circular saw cuts, it cuts with the blade coming up and out of the workpiece. So this side is going to get tear out in it. Because it's already the worst looking side, I'm okay with that. It'll keep the better looking side looking as good as it can be. I want to start by cross-cutting the piece of plywood to length. And what I did is I looked through the stack of 2x4s I bought, and I found the straightest one. And I'm going to use that as a straight edge. If you have a chalk line, feel free to use the chalk line to snap lines on the piece of plywood. But if you don't have a chalk line, the 2x4 is going to work just fine. This is a workbench after all. I've measured it where I want to cut it. Now, if I flip the 2x4 this way, you're going to see that it rocks back and forth, and that's an issue because as I try to draw along it, it wants to pivot in the center. So what I can do is flip it over, and because this thing's bowed ever so slightly, the bow makes it so it touches on the ends and I don't get that pivoting action. Now I can go ahead and use the pencil to draw the line. If you feel confident just cutting to the line freehand, by all means go for it. But if you want a little more accurate cut, you can actually use the 2x4 as a guide for the circular saw. Now there's something you need to know on the saw, and that is the distance between the edge of the blade and the edge of the base plate. In this case, this particular model happens to be 1 3/8 inches. The other thing you want to do, if you've never done this with the circular saw before, is measure the leading edge of the blade and the back edge of the blade to make sure that that blade is parallel with that base plate, because if the base plate is off at an angle, this isn't going to work. This one happens to be parallel with the base plate, so we can go ahead and do this. So 1 3/8 inches. What I need to do is set the 2x4 back from the cut line 1 3/8 inches, so that way the blade will actually be on the cut line. So if I measure one side 1 3/8 inches and come over to the other side, and I can clamp it in place. Regardless of how expensive or inexpensive the circular saw you're using is, the first thing I like to do before making the first cut on any project is to make sure the blade is actually square to the base plate. The reason for that is, depending on how these things are stored, whether they got dropped in between the last time you used it and this time, or if it's straight out of the box, the base plate might not be 90 degrees to the blade. And it's a lot easier to correct it now than after you make a whole bunch of cuts in very expensive wood. Final thing we need to do for the saw is to set the depth. Now, to square it to the base plate, you get a more accurate reading if the blade is sticking out as far as it can be. But we want to cut it with the blade just barely passing through the piece of plywood. The reason for that is it'll make a smoother cut, and we are trying to save the 2x4s underneath the plywood. So here you would cut way into those 2x4s, possibly right through them, and that would not be ideal. Every saw has some lever that unlocks the depth stop, and then the base plate pivots in order to adjust how much of the blade sticks down through the bottom. What I want to do is adjust the blade so that at the very bottom of the arc, it just barely sticks through the piece of plywood. And then I can go ahead and lock it in place. The depth set, the base plate 90 degrees to the blade, the 2x4 clamped in place. Now all I need to do
is to keep gentle pressure against the 2x4 and push the saw through the cut, and we should get a perfect cut every time. I put a thin coating of wood glue on both halves of the top. Now I can go ahead and sandwich them together. Now, starting in one corner, I can go ahead and pre-drill for some 1 1/4" drywall screws. I've adjusted the depth of cut on the circular saw to cut through the 2x4. And cutting the 2x4s is a lot like cutting the plywood. The only difference is, instead of clamping a 2x4 to it to act as a guide, I'm using this speed square as a guide. And the way I do that is I line up the blade with the cut line and I slide the speed square over to it. Now, as long as I keep the speed square pulled firmly against the edge of the 2x4, I can ride the saw against it and I get a square cut every time. I could measure 23 inches every single time, but the easier way and more accurate way is to take the piece I just cut, and I'm going to butt it up against the end of the 2x4, make sure it's flush, and I'm going to go ahead and mark the next cut line. Now, that cut line is on the inside of the two sawhorses, so I've got to scoot it over so that way the waste falls away. Now, you might have noticed when I cut with the circular saw last time, I sped up near the end. The reason I did that is if I pushed through the cut too slowly, when there's just a little bit of wood left down in the corner, it could snap off. So near the end of the cut, I want to speed up a little bit so the saw cuts it instead of gravity just breaking it. I'll repeat that same process for the rest of the cuts in the 2x4s. I'm now in the basement because I've run out of daylight outside and I'm getting ready to assemble this thing. And the last thing I need to do is to attach the final piece that's going to be the shelf below the work surface. And the frame for the shelf is the same as the frame under the actual workbench top, just made out of 2x4s held together with 2.5-inch construction screws. On top of that, for the shelf, I'm using a couple of the offcuts spliced down the center to form the shelf. And all I need to do is just make sure that the edges are flush on the front and the back, and I can go ahead and pre-drill some holes and screw it together. I have been using an 1/8-inch drill bit to pre-drill the holes, both in the plywood and in the 2x4s. The reason for that is, even though the construction screws have a self-drilling tip, I've found that the 2x4s tend to split even with that. So the drill bit is just added insurance that it's not going to split apart. To attach the plywood to the 2x4s, I'm just using 1 1/4" drywall screws. The legs for the workbench are two 2x4s with a piece of pegboard connecting the two. And the pegboard is simply glued and screwed to the back of the 2x4s. And it goes down to about 2 inches above the bottom of the leg. The reason for that is the concrete floor might not be level, and this way the workbench bears on actual feet instead of all the way along here, reducing the chance that it's going to rock. These legs were made so that way they have a fairly snug fit in this frame. Due to the fact that we're cutting things with a circular saw and using a fairly straight 2x4 as a straight edge, the tolerances we're dealing with here might not work out in our favor. So if the legs don't fit in here without lots of pressure, the thing to do would be to take the circular saw and just run it right along one edge. Just skim about the width of a blade off. Try it again until you get a nice drop-in fit. If it's too tight, it's going to bow the pegboard. If it's too loose, nothing bad really happens. Once I know that the legs fit, I'm going to go ahead and attach them with glue and screws. I think the glue is important on these leg connections because it's going to keep this thing from loosening up with changes in humidity. To hold the leg assemblies in place while I drive in the screws, I'm just going to use the quick clamps again. And now I'll attach them with some 2.5-inch construction screws. One tip when driving big screws like that with a cordless drill, if it has a gearbox on the top and it has a high and a low gear, it's better to shift it into low gear so it has more torque. And the back gets attached with more 1.25-inch screws. The back is important because it ties the lower shelf into the legs, and that provides a lot of racking resistance for the bench. The workbench isn't technically done yet, but I'm already using it to build the backsplash for the workbench. And once I have all the screws in the back, I can tip it up and attach it to the workbench, and then this project's done. Now if I tip the backsplash down into place, get it lined up with the edge, I can hold it there temporarily using one of the clamps through the back opening. This will keep it from falling off while I get some screws in.